And now I guess you're super curious what we are going to learn this time. Okay, let's get into this. First stuff is that outside pass pawn. You need to know what is this pawn and why you need to recognize it pretty quickly. Another one, you need to know what is the process of creating and having such a pawn, because this way you can just manage this. Another one, why such a pawn is so important, and at the same time, why this pawn is so dangerous. What pawn we are talking about? Outside pass pawn, of course. Another stuff that I would like to explain would be how to convert the advantage. Actually, it's pretty simple and pretty natural process into your mind. And the next one will be what happens if both sides would have the outside pass pawn or outside pass pawns, because this could be a little bit difficult for you to figure out by yourself, but I'll just help you and I'll give you a great idea to make a little bit of surprise. And the surprise I'll just explain at the later stage. And now let's get into the examples and let's get into the explanation and expanding our understanding about the outside pass pawn. First of all, let's have a look at this example. We have the pawns that are standing on the same file. Therefore, neither of the pawns can be the outside pass pawn, because outside pass pawn is the pawn that is far away from the rest of the pawns. But therefore, at this moment, you can see that neither of the sides can win, because even if one of the sides loses the pawn, the other side can just reach the key squares or not allow the opponents to reach the key squares. Therefore, at this position, it's an easy draw for both sides, no matter who is on the move. What happens if the pawn now is actually the pawn that is the passed pawn? Passed pawn means that the pawn in the way to the promotion cannot be captured by any other pawns. This is the definition of the passed pawn, by the way. About the outside pass pawn, at this moment it's a draw again, even without any other of the lines and variations that we need to know. Take notice, black has the goal of getting into the pawn and capture, white has the same goal. If white tries to get into the stairway to heaven with the pawn, they are not reaching this because black can just get into the way of the pawn, the stuff that I told you many videos ago, but this is right now why it is that much important. And the same would be for black. If black would try to get the stairway to heaven for the pawn, then white cannot allow for that because white simply stays in the path of the pawn. Therefore, either for black or for white, these would be the possible ideas to reach, and at this moment it would be pretty simple to draw this position. And therefore, even though we have outside pass pawn for both sides, at this moment the position cannot be won because there is no conditions for that. And now another position. Previously we had the position that the pawn was on the D file. At this moment the white pawn is even farther because it's on the C file. But take notice, at this moment, as we can see, if we can draw the pawn box, black king is inside the pawn box. And what about the pawn box of the black pawn? Remember, if the pawn standing on the starting position, it is the same if the pawn will be a little bit up. Therefore, at this moment, if we draw the pawn box with the black pawn, it's the same. White king is inside the pawn box of black's pawn. And therefore, the plan is the following, and the result is the same. No matter who is on the move, the position is drawn. And now let's check it out another position. We had the pawn on the D file, the pawn on the C file, and now the pawn on the B file. What's important? The distance between the pawns are going more and more they are farther away from each other. And that's why the more outside pass pawn, the better. And now what is the outcome? The outcome is the same. Black king is getting for the white pawn, white king is getting for the black pawn, neither side can win. Neither side can win because even if white king would reach one of the key squares of the passed pawn, black stands with the path of the pawn and they push the pawn forward, and white king needs to get into capturing the black's pawn, and black king is going closer and closer and capture white's pawn. Therefore, at this position, regardless who is on the move, the outcome is draw as previous positions. And now another position. This time, the distance between these two pawns are just 4 empty files. And now again, let's draw the square of the pawn. And as you can see, the black king is inside the square of the pawn. If the pawn advances, then the king is inside the square of the pawn as well. Therefore, nothing spectacular. And the same about the black's pawn. White king is still in the box of the black pawn, therefore neither side can win. The simplest way, of course, is to get into one of these 4 squares by the king, because it is the edge pawn at the same time. Therefore, no matter who is on the move, this is the drawn position, regardless who starts. And now another type of positions. Now let's have a little bit more pawns. At this moment, as you can see, there are 2 pawns by white and 2 pawns by black, and the pawns are standing on the same rank. Previously, I told you that these pawns are the strongest formation. And now, what would be the plan for winning for white? White needs to at least capture 1 pawn, and then push the pawn to the promotion with so-called stairway to heaven, as we just explained many times in the previous videos. But black doesn't allow for that, because if white starts doing this way, black does the same, and they capture both pawns, and neither of pawns can advance. Therefore, regardless who is on the move, the outcome is a draw. Now, if black is on the move, it's the same. If black would like to capture the pawns of white, they need to either get this way or the other, because they cannot attack the pawns from the front, because the pawns are having the squares in front of the pawns covered. And therefore, the same. If black king gets this way, white king gets this way. Both pawns are captured by both kings, and the result is a draw. And therefore, regardless who is on the move, either white or black, it is a draw. And now, at this position, if white to play, white gets closer with the king. First of all, they didn't give the access the king to get closer in either of the sides. At the same time, they will be using the pawn as the decoy. And now, at this moment, black gets here, trying to catch the pawn as quickly as possible and capture the pawn, and comes back to the square b7 in order to have one of these squares at the same time, not allowing white king to promote the pawn. And now white moves forward. At this moment, they do not allow the king to get closer. If the king gets this way immediately, they will not get in the time and they will lose. Therefore, black needs to stay this way, not allowing the king to get forward. After the pawn forward, now black must get into the pawn box, otherwise the pawn will escape to their promotion immediately. And now at this moment, after the black moves closer, white gets even forward, more forward. After the king gets there, white captures the pawn, and the plan is simple. To capture the pawn, get into the square b7, and then push the pawn to the last rank, to the promotion. After the capture, let's see if it is possible and if black is in time or it is not in time. And now at this moment, you probably can see that one of these 6 squares are the key squares where we are talking about the edge pawn, and now black is in time reaching this square. If black gets into b8, they can get a8, it's a simple draw. And if white king gets in front of the pawn, we just know that these 2 squares back and forth, we are having a draw. Therefore, at this moment, black reaches a draw. And now, what happens if we just get a little bit different way? Instead of getting with the king, we will immediately push the pawn forward. Let's check it out. White pushes the pawn forward, and black as quickly as possible try to capture the pawn and gets the same plan. Getting into the squares highlighted below would guarantee a draw for black. And now, white must capture the pawn that is the past one, because they cannot get into this one, because the pawn would just escape to their promotion, and therefore they use the white pawn as the decoy. And now the plan is the same as the previous position. And now at this moment, we are going closer and closer with the kings, and as you can see, black king is getting into the square pretty much quickly and comfortably, getting into the corner, therefore it's a draw. And therefore, the conclusion with this position, even though we have the outside pass pawn, it doesn't mean that we can always win. Why? Because at this case, it was the case of the edge pawn, and the king, black king, after capturing the white pawn, reached one of these squares highlighted blue. And that's why it was a draw. Now let's check out what happens if it is black to move. If black to move, black tries not to allow white king to infiltrate and getting as close as possible into the pawn that is the outside pass pawn and capture this as quickly as possible, and then, if possible, capture the other pawn and push the pawn to the promotion. And now, what happens if white pushes the pawn? If white pushes the pawn, we are going into the pawn to capture as quickly as possible. After that, we just capture this way. And now, at this moment, this is the same position. The king would just get into the position right here, or right there. And then, after the capture, black king comfortably get into the position that we already mentioned. Therefore, let's check out quickly what would happen. And after this one, as we can see, the king is pretty safe. It's a draw due to the edge pawn. And therefore, at this moment, after having the king f6, if white push the pawn forward, they are unable to win. What happens if white king is trying to make a little bit more difficult life for black? And now, as you can see, at this moment, neither of the king can get into the squares on the 5th rank. Black has the same plan, to capture the pawn and get into this pawn, or even safer, get into one of these squares highlighted blue. And now, at this moment, after the king gets g6, we are going here, and now all of the captures take place as we already remember, right? And now we are going closer and closer, and even though it looks like that white will be able to reach this square immediately, after white would reach this square, it would be winning, but now it is black that is on one of the key squares highlighted red this time, and they can reach either the corner square, or if the king blocks the pawn, they will be going back and forth over the blue squares, and the result is a draw. And therefore, the conclusion from this position, regardless who is on the move, nobody can win this position. Neither white, neither black. And now let's have a look at the position that I a little bit improved. What did I change, you may ask? You can see that I just add one pawn by white, one pawn by black. At this moment, the position is pretty straightforward win. Why? Because the plan would be the same. We are just having the pawn as the decoy. King must capture the pawn, but we capture this pawn, and we have two pawns winning easily. And therefore, if white to move, white pushes the pawn, king gets closer in order to have this pawn captured as quickly as possible. After the series of moves that we have previously, all of the ideas are the same, but there is one important difference. We have two pawns versus one. And now, even though is the h pawn would not exist, the b3 pawn and the king are having the connection, because the king has already reached one of the key squares, therefore a win. And therefore, at this position, if we just add these pawns into the position, if white is to move, it's easily win. Now we might ask, what happens if it is black to move? Is it still winning for white, or maybe black is able to draw? After black plays with king f6, not allowing the king to infiltrate, white pawn moves forward. The idea is the same. The pawn functions as the decoy. The king must stay in the pawn box and capture the pawn as quickly as possible. White king captures the passed pawn, and then after capture these two, reaches the winning position. And therefore, at this moment, after king gets closer, the same idea as previously, and this is game over, because after the capture of this, we have the king into the key squares of the b3 pawn. Even after, without the a pawn, it's a win. And now let's check out a little bit more complex position, because you may ask what would happen if white king would be having a little bit more trouble to infiltrate. Now, at this position, as we can see, the outside passed pawn is on the a file, and black king at this moment is inside the pawn box. Therefore, everything perfectly clear. Now, if white to move, white makes a pawn breakthrough. They are trying to make the pawns shattered, and at the same time, now it is black. What black can do? If white would have another move after the capture, king couldn't recapture because then pawn moves forward and the pawn box is not reached by the black king. Therefore, at this moment, they either needs to capture or push the pawn. If they push the pawn forward, we are just getting closer with the king, and now the idea is the same. We just use the a pawn as the decoy. The black king must capture this pawn, otherwise it promotes. After that, we capture the pawn e6, g6, f5, reaching very easy winning position. And therefore, at this moment, as you can see, we can just use the decoy. After the king gets into the pawn, we are just capturing these two and winning very, very easily. And I guess everything should be understood by now. What happens after pushing the pawn forward? Black doesn't push the pawn forward with check, but they capture the pawn, you may ask. We just recapture, and take notice, the king cannot get closer. We have the fixed pawns, and the idea is the same. The pawn, that is the outside pass pawn, very far away from the black king, acts as the decoy. Now, white king's plan is the following. Capturing the passed pawn, after that capturing the pawn that is on the way of the promotion for the g-pawn, getting into f7 or h7, having stairway to heaven, and the pawn reaches the promotion. And now, after black gets closer and closer, not allowing white to get with the king any closer, we are just having this pawn as the decoy. And now the king gets for the pawn, and we are just having the plan that we already mentioned. And now, even at this position, due to the pawn cross the half of the board, we can see that the king has one of the key squares taken. And therefore, at this moment, it's win position, regardless if the king would be in one of these squares. And now, what happens at the same position, but if it is black to move, you may ask. With black to move, it seems like there are a lot of moves to be played, because all of the pawns can move forward, therefore 3 moves by the pawns, and the king can go in any of these squares highlighted blue. The problem is the following. If the king gets into any squares on the f file, it gets outside the pawn box and the pawn promotes. Therefore, technically, the king has only 5 squares to go. Actually, even 4, it is on the 5th square. And if the pawns move forward at this moment, we just capture the pawn. After pawn capture, we have the same idea. The pawn shields as the decoy, white king captures the pawn on e6, captures the pawn on g5, stands in one of the squares highlighted red at this moment into the key squares of the pawn, and the position is won. And now, even if black would just try to make this stuff a little bit more difficult, we use the pawn as the decoy, and the plan is identical as previously, and as you can see, the position is easily winning. What happens if black gets different idea when pushing the pawn from g6 to g5? If they push the pawn to the square f5, you may ask that this would result in a draw because there would be not that many pawns to promote, or maybe these 3 pawns would be exchanged for these 2. It's not like that. After the pawn captures, now if they capture this way, we are just going forward. And idea is the same. The pawn acts as the decoy, the king must march to stop the pawn from promotion, the king gets to f6. If the pawn moves forward, we capture with the king and capture another pawn, and it traditionally, if the king gets for the pawn to capture, we capture the pawn g6, the pawn f5, and after getting either to the square g6, f6 or e6, we are just in one of the key squares of the passed pawn. Therefore, after black gets to the pawn, we are going here. After the capture, we can see that it's already pretty easily winning, and at this moment, regardless where would be the black king, the position is winning because the king is in one of the key squares of the pawn. And now let's check out what would happen if we do not play the pawn g5, not f5, but maybe the pawn e5. After pawn e5, we have this idea. Pawn captures. After the pawn captures, we just recapture, and the idea is the same. This pawn acts as the decoy. The king gets closer to capture the pawn. We just capture this pawn, and we are already on the key squares of the pawn. Therefore, it's the same as previously. I'll just show it quickly. And now already, even if the king doesn't capture the pawn, the position is winning, the king stands in one of the key squares. And therefore, at this moment, we do not need to analyze any further. If we capture with the pawn and black says, okay, but we want to, as much as possible, reduce the number of pawns, after the capture and recapture, we have the pawns that after the pawns move forward, I mean the a pawn, we see that we already have the floating square that is going beyond the last rank. Therefore, even without the king's assistance, at this position, white would be on the winning position. And now, if black would not just start pushing any of the pawns, but we will get with the king to make a little bit less impact for the king, because the king cannot infiltrate as quickly as possible, what do we do? The same idea. The king must capture the pawn, therefore at this moment we need to push the pawn on g5. What do we do? After the capture, we just reach the position, the same as previously. The king must capture the pawn, that is the outside pass pawn, we capture these two, and we are just already reaching the winning position. After pushing the pawn forward, if black decides not to exchange any of the pawns, it seems like the position is closer and closer to a draw. But now, at this position, the same. The king needs to get into the pawn to capture, and after the capture, we have the same idea as we previously mentioned. If black would try to muddy the water a little bit more, after the capture, check. If the king gets here, because now this pawn is the protected passed pawn, therefore it looks like the king cannot get outside, but at the same time, if the pawn moves forward, we are just having the pawns that are having the floating square that is going beyond the last rank. Therefore, it is the winning position already. And therefore, after e5, the king cannot capture neither of these pawns. If the king gets for this pawn, the other escapes. If the pawn gets into this pawn, the other escapes. And therefore, even if the king would be in the corner, this position is winning for white. Why? Because the floating square is going beyond the last rank. And therefore, at this moment, we can see that any of the replies by black makes the winning position by white. Of course, if black gets this way, we are going closer, and as we just mentioned before, we are just having the same plan. Black doesn't have that much time to counter, and we are just reaching winning position. And now a little bit of idea that I would like to show you what could be done if you'd like to play out a little bit more with the positions when there are the pawns. There are the outside pass pawns, and take notice, these pawns are pretty far away from whites, the same as whites are pretty far away from blacks. And now what could be done at this position? At this position, many plans could be done, but it will get into the position either with the pawns that cannot be captured, let's say with the pawns, if I even just set up, let's say here, and the king would be on the square g5, and the king cannot capture h4 pawn because the pawn g5 runs to the promotion. And the same with black. If black would have the pawns right here, if the king is there, the king cannot capture the backward pawn because the other pawn gets to the promotion. And therefore, at this position, even if this position can hide a lot of various ideas, I encourage you to check it out by yourself, all of the possible ideas if any sides can win, regardless who is on the move. Therefore, it's the bonus part for you to check out by yourself and see what conclusions you can draw. And now a special bonus for you, for your perseverance, for the ability to learn with me, and for the patience that sometimes you need to wait a little bit longer for the videos that I am creating and not always the time that you expected they are being published. Therefore, let's get And now I'll just show you some simple examples how we can play it out with this one. Now, as you can see, at this moment, are losing, and it would be great exercise to figure out a little bit like summary of the outside pass pawn and the floating square. I bet you will learn a lot. You can treat it as the additional homework or some kind of, let's say, opportunity to learn more and more with the bonus part. Thank you very much for the support, and I'm happy that I can support you with my knowledge and a little bit of ideas. And at the same time, if you would like to check out how well you understood this topic, I'll just put the link into the description to the chess endgame database that you can play out. And the time for the summary. And now let's get into a few of the points that may be really important to you to understand why outside pass pawn is that much important and what to do with that. First, what are the goals of creating outside passed pawn? The first goal is to decoy the king from protecting its pawns, because this way, if the king is not protecting the pawns, you can just simply grab the pawns, and after that winning the game is pretty easy. Whenever you're going to infiltrate your opponent's position with your king, it's advantageous. Therefore, it's the second goal, to infiltrate the position with your king and then capture the pawns. As easy as that. Next point is, after reaching both goals, at least one of the pawns must promote. Otherwise, we do not make that much sense to sacrifice the pawn that is very important to make the queen. Therefore, the pawn is the decoy, and after reaching both goals, at least one of your pawns must promote. It's as easy as that. You need to know and remember that before creating outside pass pawn, you need to try to advance your king and other pawns. At this case, as you can see, if it is white to move, white can draw with after b4. This is the only move that draws, and at this position, it is pretty much miracle because black's king is very, very active, white king is super passive, and the pawns are on the initial position. Therefore, try to advance your king and your pawns as well. If this would be black's on the move, then it's winning for black. Why? Because black starts to capturing the pawns on the left side, on the queen side, and the king cannot get into the square f5 to capture the pawns the same as the black king would capture white's pawns. Therefore, at this position with black to move, black is so much active that they can win the game. And the last point is that the further the outside pass pawn from the other passed pawns, the better. Why is that? Because at this position, as we analyzed, you know that this position is drawn. Why? Because white king must first capture the pawn on the e file, then capture the pawn on the a file, and the third task is to get into the square b7 in order to help the pawn to promote. And black has pretty simple task, to capture the pawn on the h file and get into one of the 6 squares highlighted yellow, and it guarantees a draw. And what happens if the pawns are shifted left? If the pawns are shifted left, at this moment, between the pawn on the C file and the H file, there are way more empty files. Therefore, white's task is a way simpler. They capture the pawn on the C file, on the A file, reaching B7, and the pawn gets to promotion. And with black has a lot of moves to capture the white pawn on the H file. That's why outside passed pawn and its power, and they are not ready to get into the square C7 or C8. Therefore, at this position, no matter who is on the move, white wins. I guess this is the short summary, but I guess the topic is not that much difficult, and I hope you understand everything. And now, after this class is over, I guess you should know what is the passed pawn, what is the outside passed pawn especially, and why it is that much important to have it, how to convert the advantage having such a pawn, and why it is so important to understand the idea behind it, especially if you have the opportunity to create such a passed pawn, and how to manage it. I hope you are having great fun and understand more and more. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. Take care.